Hello, everybody. As promised, this is the completion of the lecture on Galatians. Both classes are essentially at the same point, and as a consequence, I'm going to try to finish up our time in Galatians by way of this video. So you'll want to take notes. It's important that you do so because you will have test questions on this material. So be prudent about things, and you will be rewarded accordingly. Okay, when when we left off, we were talking about Galatians. We had gotten through essentially the epistolary structure of the letter and noted how both Galatians both begins and ends with a fair amount of demonstrable anger on Paul's part. He seems rather annoyed by his opponents in the Galatian churches. They've caused him lots of problems. We gave them a name. We called them Judaizers, and we noted that these are people who there were Christian Jews, ethnic Jews, who attempted to make Jews of all Gentile converts to Christianity. They felt like before God will accept you as a Gentile, that you must first begin to live like an ethnic Jew, and Paul fundamentally disagreed with that. Before he can engage the Judaizers directly in debate about what constitutes an acceptable standard to God and what constitutes salvation, he first has to defend himself against the charge of being something less than an apostle, because one of the ways, surefire ways to kind of disarm someone's argument is to attack their credibility, and that's exactly what had happened to Paul. So the body of the letter, it begins by Paul presenting his defense of his own apostolic authority. Now, earlier in the class this semester, we discussed, what apostleship means to Luke. In the Acts of the Apostles, he lays out essentially some guidelines for apostolic authority, and he said, of course, the function of an apostle is to bear witness to Christ's resurrection. Now, Paul, of course, can do that because he witnessed the risen Lord. Another requirement was that the person in question be a male. Now, of course, Paul was a male and satisfied that, but the remaining requirement that he be someone who admitted of experience, a certain amount of experience, that was a person that was with Jesus from the time of John's baptism all the way up until Jesus' resurrection. Of course, Paul did not satisfy in Luke's estimation. Also, he did not go through any sort of bureaucratic appointment process by the early church. He wasn't selected as one of the 12. And so, we found that Luke is kind of reticent to speak about Paul as an apostle in the Acts, but if you look to the letters, certainly Paul felt like he was deserving of that title. So if he can't talk about his own apostolic status on Lucan terms, how does he talk about it in this letter? In Galatians, what Paul suggests is that the nature of his apostolic authority is of the decidedly heavenly variety. In the first verse of the letter, he says, in fact, that he is the apostle to the Gentiles, quote, neither by human commission nor from human authorities, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead. In other words, he's trying to kind of distance himself from any sort of bureaucratic process and bureaucratic kind of approval, any kind of vote on the part of the early church to grant him that status. Instead, he says that he was an apostle as a direct consequence of a revelation that he had of Jesus Christ. He talks about that in the opening chapter, verses 11 and 12. And he also says that he became an apostle as a direct result of God's elective activity. And there's a fair amount of irony kind of built into that, given the fact that Paul had earlier in his life been an opponent of Christianity and had persecuted the church. So he kind of goes out of his way in the opening chapter to distance himself from any sort of appointment process. He says that he was an apostle, and he says that his apostolic authority derives directly from God's elective activity in his own experience of the risen Lord. So the argument develops a little bit later on in chapter 1 and into chapter 2, where he tries to establish his prolonged apostolic independence from any Jerusalem authority. The Jerusalem church in early Christianity was, of course, very, very important. And Paul, he is determined in this letter to kind of distance himself from any sort of direct ties to the Jerusalem church establishment. But he doesn't do so without recognizing that he had and that he desired their endorsement. He talks about this in the opening 10 verses of chapter 2. The way that he lays out in his autobiographical comments in chapters 1 and 2, the way out he lays out his story of conversion and his engagement in ministry for the first several years, for more than 17 years of his time as the apostle to the Gentiles. He suggests that he was essentially unknown to the churches of Judea. He says that upon his conversion, he spent an unspecified amount of time in Arabia. Following that, he had a 3-year stay in Damascus. He admits to having been in conversation with Peter and James for about 15 days, but stopped short of saying that that was some sort of kind of an interview-like process where he had to kind of gain their approval, their stamp of approval, and instead he just simply describes it as kind of a get-to-know-me thing. He admits to making a second trip to Jerusalem, but only 14 years after his initial conversion. And it was at that time where he gave a review to the Judean church leaders of the sort of gospel that he preached. And he says that they willingly endorsed his ministry without imposing any sort of Torah restrictions on Gentiles. That's chapter 2, verses 6 through 10. But he also says in the midst of all of that, that they did not require one of his co-workers, a guy named Titus, to be circumcised. Titus was a Gentile, and he said that evidently the church leaders found his acquittal of his ministry so persuasive that they didn't even require Titus to be circumcised, and really kind of only asked one thing, namely that he remember the poor. Now, there's some interesting things that go on in this whole process, especially when it comes to his note in chapter 2 verse 10 about they're requiring that he remember the poor. And that could be read in two different ways. On the one hand, it could be read and understood as a requirement that Paul kind of purchase his way into good standing within the church by engaging in a charitable project. Okay, at Lee, one of the things that we do is require you as undergraduates to complete 80 service hours upon graduation. You kind of have to earn your way into graduating or candidate status for graduation by completing those service hours. I mean, is it that? In which case it would really seem like the Jerusalem church is telling Paul what to do, or can Paul read it and understand it a different way? Maybe what he's saying in this whole process is that the early church needed his help, that they came to him and asked him that, would you please remember our poor and help our poor out. Whenever money gets involved, as I told you in the last class, money really kind of changes everything, and it's an interesting dynamic that goes on there, and certainly the autobiographical content of Galatians, it seems in many ways to kind of present a different story of Paul's conversion to Christianity and his introduction to the church hierarchy than we find in Acts, certainly in Acts chapter 15, for instance. As a result of the Jerusalem Council, they determined that any Gentile converts to Christianity have to avoid certain things. They have to avoid blood, or consuming blood. They have to avoid the consumption of idol meat. They have to avoid the consumption of any sort of meat that's not killed and disposed of in a ritualistically pure way. They can't eat things that have been strangled, for instance. I mean, when you strangle an animal and don't bleed it out, well, of course, the blood stays in the meat, and so that had a corrupting effect in the eyes of any of Jews in the first century. And then they also had to abstain from fornication. Now, the reason the early church makes these stipulations for Gentile converts to Christianity is that they wanted to maintain table fellowship, wanted that to be a possibility for Jewish and Gentile believers. And they turn over, according to according to Luke in the Acts of the Apostles, they turn over, the early church drafts a letter in which they stipulate these things, and they give the responsibility of getting the news out to the Gentile communities precisely to Paul. Now, I mean, if you have in Galatians, Paul saying something very, very different, namely that the Jerusalem establishment didn't impose any restrictions on him and only asked him, to help their poor. That's a peculiar kind of different story, and that's not the only place where the differences kind of pile up. I mean, even the particulars of the nature of Paul's conversion. In Acts, for instance, when Paul is saved on the Damascus Road, he spends some time in Damascus, and as soon as he leaves, the first place that he goes is Jerusalem. And once he gets there, it's Barnabas who presents him to the apostles. But, here in Galatians, he argues that for the first 17 years of his ministry, he did not know the Judean Christians. And, when he finally got around to getting kind of presented to Peter and James, and even by the time he finally got around to being presented in a more formal way to the Judean church leaders, they didn't lay any stipulations on him. And that's a fascinating thing. It's a big question in New Testament scholarship. How exactly does one reconcile or read these two different accounts of Paul's conversion side by side? Well, I think what you have to do, the prudent thing to do is to realize, all right, that in this letter, one of the things that Paul is attempting to accomplish is he's trying to create and establish a critical distance between himself and the Jerusalem church establishment, just so that he can claim that title of apostle to the Gentiles. The way that part of Paul's argument in Galatians concludes is with him talking about his confrontation with Peter in Antioch in chapter 2, verses 11 through 14. Now, in those verses, the situation that he describes, it centers around a table fellowship with Gentiles. Evidently, prior to the appearance of a contingent of people from James, and Paul kind of refers to them as the circumcision party. Prior to their appearance in Antioch, all of the Christians ate in fellowship together. Paul, Peter, Barnabas, others. But once these people from James showed up from the church in Jerusalem, Paul, he criticizes Peter and even his ministerial co-worker Barnabas for acting in a somewhat hypocritical fashion. He says that everyone used to eat together, but once the people from from Jerusalem showed up, there were certain Jewish believers who kind of backed out of table fellowship, evidently because they were intimidated or in some way kind of convicted. So what Paul does is he contrasts Peter's kind of insincere behavior with regard to Gentile Christians in Galatia with his own behavior. He says, I never changed my approach to you. I always continued to engage in table fellowship with you, and I never backed out. And of course, the reason why he wants to bring this up is pretty obvious. He's trying to show the Galatians that if they're trying to weigh, who really is willing to identify with Gentile believers, it's certainly going to be him as opposed to someone like Peter. Now, this is an example of what you call an honor contest in the ancient world. The ancient society was an honor shame society, and if you wanted to kind of ratchet up your level of respectability in that society, one of the things that you could do is challenge someone in public to a debate. And in the event that you were able to kind of best this person who admittedly whose honor ranking was higher than your own, in the event that you were to able to challenge them from below and defeat them in public debate, that then whatever honor they had, you accrued as a consequence. So what happens to Peter here, and we've seen this, before in our discussion of the Gospel of John, where the beloved disciple is kind of put on display as being in a contest of sorts with Peter as a representative of the apostolic church. Peter, and Paul refers to him as a pillar of the Jerusalem community. Whenever he confronts Peter about his insincere activity with regard to Gentile believers, the honor that Peter had is conferred on to Paul, and this is all playing a part of Paul's desire to prove to the Gentile believers in the Galatian communities that he really deserves the title apostle. Once he's done that, he can move on to what he really wants to discuss, which is, of course, meaningful theological issues. But he has to be able to speak to those theological issues as someone who knows what he's talking about. And this is an example of first century church politics. So once we reach the end of chapter 2, Paul is finally in a position to turn his attention to what he really wants to discuss, which is the threat of the Judaizers. One of the things that I mentioned early on in the Galatians lecture that I gave to you in class was that Galatians is probably the angriest Pauline epistles. It has what's called a polemical tone. And you understand what I mean by tone because we've already talked about the tone of Philippians as being happy. Whenever you inquire about a document's tone, you're talking about the emotional feel that it carries. To describe something as having a polemical tone means that, well, there's fighting words in this letter. Paul is obviously kind of angry, and there's a number of things that kind of contribute to the creation of that angry sort of fighting words feeling that this letter has. I mean, one of the things is instead of a Thanksgiving section, you have Paul pronouncing a curse on those who would preach a gospel different from his own. In chapter 3, verse 1, he kind of, an exasperated Paul, he says, "Oh, you foolish Galatians." And those are harsh words, that he would call them, suggest that they're behaving in a foolish way. In chapter 5, verse 12, he says, "Look, I wish that those who are troubling you," and of course he's talking about the Judaizers who want to impose circumcision on Gentile converts to Christ. He says, "I wish that those who are troubling you would mutilate themselves." And literally, and that's a sanitized translation, literally what Paul is getting at is, he wants these people to kind of, move the knife up a little higher on themselves. And those are very, very strong words. So, Paul was obviously kind of angry when writing this letter. And that, of course, broaches the question, who made him so mad? Who got Paul so out of whack when he was writing this letter that he would kind of vent in such strong terms? And the answer is the Judaizers. We've talked about this some. These were Christian Jews who wanted to make Jews out of all Gentile converts to Christianity by insisting that they be Torah observant in an effort to kind of gain God's initial acceptance. Before they could really be Christians, they had to become like Jews. In other words, they were advocates of a specifically Jewish form of legalism. The phrase "works of the law," which you'll find repeatedly used in this letter, is probably a reference not to the law as a whole, And we know as much because Paul, he'll quote, for instance, the Ten Commandments in a very affirming way in some of his letters. He didn't want to reject all of the law, but there were certain parts of the law that he found unnecessary for Gentiles to maintain. I'm talking about things like circumcision, also the dietary regulations, and Gentile observance of events on the Jewish religious calendar. These are kind of distinctively Jewish things that Paul felt was unnecessary for Gentiles to kind of take up, but he had his detractors. He also references in chapter 2, verse 12, the members of James' circumcision faction. And in chapter 5, verse 4, he says, this is more strong language, he says that those who would seek to kind of impose these sorts of specifically Jewish Torah restrictions on his audience members in trying to kind of, for instance, force circumcision on Gentile converts, they had effectively kind of severed themselves from Christ. Once again, that's strong language as well. I'm certain that Paul's opponents, those who wanted to, the Judaizers themselves, those who wanted to kind of encourage Torah observance on the part of Gentiles, in all likelihood, they considered themselves Christians. But Paul, he probably did not feel the same way. Okay, well, exactly who were they? Paul is gracious enough not to name names. Certainly he could have, and elsewhere he does. But in this letter, he doesn't name exactly who his opponents are. Instead, he asks questions in chapter 3, verse 1, for instance. There's two questions, one in chapter 3, verse 1, and one in chapter 5, verse 7. In chapter 3, verse 1, Paul says, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified?" Now, it may be the case that question in this one in chapter 5, verse 7, which says, "You were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth?" It may be the case that those questions are the answer to them that Paul knows. Perhaps he actually knows who these people are, and in which case they would effectively be kind of rhetorical questions, and he's asking his audience to kind of fill in the blank for themselves. And maybe that would be like a polite way he has of criticizing his opponents. But it's also possible that in Paul's mind, he just simply did not know. It may be, in other words, an honest question. Who were his opponents exactly? Scholars call them Judaizers, and they call them Judaizers because they really don't know who they were. But what their criticism, what the Judaizers' criticisms of Paul were, is clear. First of all, the Judaizers felt that Paul was somewhat deficient in certain ways. His gospel was good, but only to a point. And even his own pedigree, as what he claimed to be an apostle, they would deny that. But even his own pedigree was in some ways deficient. They denied, for instance, that he was an apostle. There's only 12 of those, and there's not an opening. And even if there is an opening, Paul need not apply because he doesn't kind of satisfy the very basic requirements. But they also said that his gospel, not only are his apostolic credentials incomplete or deficient, but even his gospel was incomplete to the extent that he did not tell Jews or Gentiles rather, about their responsibility of living like ethnic Jews. So who were they? We don't know, but at least we know how they felt about Paul and his gospel. So what this conflict requires of Paul in the letter's body is that he come up, first of all, with a defense of his apostolic authority, which he has, and second of all, that he demonstrate to his audience the proper role of the law. I mean, if you have the Torah, Why is it that Gentiles, in Paul's estimation, need not pay attention to the specifically Jewish commands? All right. So how does Paul feel about the law? That's basically what we're going to talk about. For Paul, he regarded Torah observance as meaningless for initial salvation. In fact, he really felt like that's one of the constants of salvation history. God never has required someone to kind of earn their way into his good graces by following certain stipulations. Instead, what he would say, Paul would say, is that one's initial incorporation into the body of Christ, or into the religion of the God of Israel, has always been come about as a consequence of God's initial gracious first move. One never earns their way into God's good graces by doing good works. Instead, a person is simply faithfully responsive to God's initial move in their direction. All right. And he appeals to the story of Abraham in defense of that idea. Well, then, why did the Jews have the law? Well, Paul, in Romans 3:19 through 25, presents the Jewish Torah as God's attempt to provide an initial stopgap measure to confront the problem of human sinfulness. All right, I remember a number of years ago when Hurricane Katrina hit Louisiana and just ravaged New Orleans. I remember that one of the things that happened was that the levee system, which held back the waters of Lake Pontchartrain, which ironically enough are above the city of New Orleans itself, what happened when the levee systems which held back those waters were destroyed by the hurricane, all the water that was in Lake Pontchartrain spilled into the city, and it imperiled a lot of people. It did a lot of damage. Well, what had to happen before the city could be re-inhabited was all of those breaks in the levee system had to be repaired, and they had these big helicopters that would carry these gigantic sandbags. They would carry these sandbags over the breaks in the levee system and drop them, and they, by doing that, drawing sandbag after sandbag after sandbag, they were able to kind of repair the break in the levee, and then they were able to pump all the waters out of New Orleans and back into Lake Pontchartrain. But I know that the current residents of New Orleans are glad that the Army Corps of Engineers didn't just leave it with a sandbag. All right, after they, temporarily, provided a stopgap measure, a fix for the levee system, they came back in later and did things right with steel reinforced concrete, and so tried to ensure that the sort of tragedy that occurred with Hurricane Katrina would never subsequently happen again. In essence, that's the way that Paul presents the utility of the law. He suggests in Galatians chapter 3 that the law's purpose was to kind of serve as a tutor for human sinfulness. Its function is to reveal sin for what it was, and in a sense it served as humanity's moral custodian until the appearance of Christ, but it was never intended to provide a final solution to the problem of human sinfulness. So I suppose one of the things that he's trying to communicate is any Jewish person who would pride him or herself on their possession of the law really doesn't understand quite yet that the law itself is incapable of permanently redressing the problem of human corruption. Instead, that had to wait until the appearance of Christ. And so, another way he kind of drives that point home is by setting up an analogy. One of the things that Paul, one of the Old Testament stories that Paul appeals to with a fair amount of regularity is the story of Abraham. Now, we all know that Abraham was given promises by God. He was told that God would cause him to become the father of a great nation. So he was promised progeny, children, and many of them. Father Abraham had many sons. He was promised progeny, and the second promise that God made to Abraham was property. He said, I'll cause you to become the father of a great nation of people, and I'm going to give you a land, a place that I will show you, and challenged Abraham to kind of leave his ancestral home, strike out on his own, and go to the land that he would show him. And Paul says, well, Abraham responded to God's extension of grace to him, extension of the offer to kind of live in covenant fidelity and a relationship to God with faith, and God reckoned his faith as righteousness. Well, Abraham kept getting older and older and older, and his wife also kept getting older and older and older, and they didn't have any children. So, since Sarah was postmenopausal, she thought, well, there's no way that I'm going to have kids. So they kind of took things into their own hands, and she approached her husband Abraham and said, look, why don't you sire a child by my servant girl, Hagar, which is a horrible name. Why don't you take Hagar, sire a child with her, and she can bear a child for me. All right. And of course, Abraham, being who he was, said, that sounds like a great idea to me. So, of course, he gets Hagar pregnant, and she gives birth to Ishmael. And it's not long after that Hagar despises Sarah, and this of course leaves Sarah mad. And for that matter, it really doesn't. Their actions, trying to kind of help God's processes along, don't make God very happy either. And God confronts Abraham about this and says, look, pal, I'm going to make good on my promises, but it's always been my intention for you to have a child with your wife. It's your wife that should give birth to the child of promise, the one through whom I will cause you to become a father of a great nation. And you know the story. Eventually, Sarah gets pregnant and gives birth to Isaac, and it's through Isaac, the child of faith, the child that human attempts to kind of help God's processes along. Those fail in Ishmael, but it's Isaac, by way of contrast, represents the child of faith, and the one through whom God accomplishes His purposes. So really, when Paul invokes the story of Abraham in Galatians, he does so for the sake of setting up an analogy. And the analogy runs something like this, and you'll want to get this down for testing purposes. He will say that Ishmael, all right, Hagar's son, Ishmael is to Isaac, Sarah's son. Ishmael is to Isaac as the Judaizers are to Pauline Christian believers. Ishmael is to Isaac as the Judaizers are to Christians. Okay, Ishmael represents human pretension and the attempt to help God's processes along when God does not really need any help. Isaac, by way of contrast, represents willing, faithful human cooperation with the purposes of God, who is able to bring about the miraculous solely on his own. All that he requires of human beings is a faithful response. So Ishmael is to Isaac as the Judaizers are to Christians. Paul, he kind of casts the Judaizers as those who, without good cause, want to impose regulations on Gentiles so that they have to kind of prove their merit to God, when in fact God, in the person of Jesus Christ, has extended the same promises to Gentiles as he initially, through Abraham, extended to Jews. All right, the good news of the gospel for Paul is that the gospel has been expanded and been extended across ethnic lines, and it is no longer necessary. In fact, it's not necessary to be a Jew in order to be in God's good graces and a member of the covenant people. Now, as a consequence of all this, some people have got the wrong idea that Paul is an antinomian, that he's someone who is against the law, but that's not the case. Instead, I like to think of Paul as someone who emphasizes that freedom from the Torah, especially those Jewish parts, freedom from the Torah allows us as human beings, as those who respond to God's extension of grace in the person of Jesus Christ, to practice neighborly love apart from any sort of external or superficial restriction. I remember when my daughters were little, we used to live really proximate, just a couple of blocks away from their elementary school. And I remember, I used to walk them to school every morning and, drop them off. But before I would allow them to leave, I would require that they give me a kiss. Now, the older that they got, the less they were kind of altogether excited about kissing their daddy in front of, all of their elementary school friends. And, they'd get excited about going to school. And, they'd want to run into school. And, before I would let them go, I'd say, hey, no, hold on. You got to come back here and give me a kiss. Now, there were times that I forgot because I got in a rush that, I forgot to give them a kiss. And so, I want to say, going to school, kid. I've got things to do. I've got to, go teach a class of my own. I've got to do some writing. I've got to do some honeydews, whatever it was. And there were a couple of times when I myself forgot to kind of live by my own law. And so it was interesting to me that in the event that I would forget to kind of enforce the law and tell them, come here and give me a kiss before you go to school, there were times when I would kind of send them on their way, and then I would hear this little voice behind me saying, Daddy, don't leave yet. Wait, Daddy, come back here. You haven't given me my kiss. Now, how do I know, all right, as a parent, that my daughters love me, all right? It's one thing to kind of compel those that you care for, all right, to do things. It's another thing to kind of set them free and allow them the opportunity to do them spontaneously. And one of the ways that I know that my daughters genuinely love me is because even when I forget that, hey, they got to give me a kiss before they leave me, they just request it on their own. And that's very, very meaningful to me. And I think that has something to say about Paul's understanding of the real function of the law. I mean, certainly, we know as a consequence of the appearance of the law, we know something about God's standards of justice. Now, Paul certainly didn't think that everything that the law contains should be imposed, if forced upon Gentile converts to Christianity. Was he an antinomian as a consequence? No, but he certainly valued, talk about freedom from the law to the extent that it allows us as, thankful human beings to kind of live up to God's standard of justice, and not by compulsion, but as a consequence of our freely chosen decision to attempt to respond to his extension of grace in appropriate ways. So Paul would never say that Christians are free from moral constraints. You can look at chapter 5, verse 13 of Galatians for kind of help on that. Instead, he would say that as a consequence of God's work in Christ, Gentiles can be who they are as a people, and we all, as a consequence, have an opportunity to respond lovingly to God and to, in our own way. That repay is not the right word, but we have an opportunity to respond to God's initial extension of grace and favor towards us in a very productive way that moves beyond just the simple demonstration of trust or faith in His promises to engage in appropriate sorts of Christian ethical conduct that is a responsible response to the love of God. All right. I could continue, but I don't think that that's required. I think we've talked enough about Galatians. I hope to see you all whenever we have our test review session this Sunday evening at 6:30 in the School of Religion building. Hope to see you all at the lecture tonight, which starts at 7:30. I trust that God's blessings be yours and that you have a good day. Bye.